Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Today we're diving into some declassified documents from the Cold War.
Okay.
And this is a plan that is so out there you'd think it was made up.
Really?
It's called Operation Northwoods.
Never even heard of that.
I hadn't either until we started looking into this. But before we get into the specifics, can you give us a little context? What was going on in the world, specifically between us and Cuba, that would lead to something like this even being thought up?
Well, you have to remember, the early 60s, that was like peak Cold War tension, right?
Mm-hmm.
The U.S., the Soviets, both sides are just stockpiling nukes like it's going out of style. Paranoia is rampant.
Right.
And then, boom, 1959, Fidel Castro comes to power in Cuba, which, just a stone's throw from Florida.
90 miles.
Yeah, 90 miles. Practically our backyard, and he goes full-on communist, buddies up with the Soviets. You can imagine how well that went over in Washington.
Yeah, I'm guessing. Talk about a national security freakout.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. saw Castro as a direct threat, like this Soviet puppet right on their doorstep, potentially a launch pad for, well, who knows what. Things were tense, to say the least.
So the Cold War is already at a boiling point, and then Cuba basically becomes communist. Okay, I get why the U.S. government might be a little on edge, but this Operation Northwoods thing, that's next level. What exactly were they planning?
So Operation Northwoods, and this is where it gets wild, it was a series of proposals put together by the Department of Defense, no less, to basically cook up a reason for the U.S. to invade Cuba.
Cook up a reason. Those are some loaded words.
That's putting it mildly. We're talking about faking attacks, making it look like Cuba was the aggressor.
You mean like staging stuff, false flag operations? I mean, how far were they willing to go with this?
Pretty far, my friend. Pretty far.
Yeah.
We're talking sinking U.S. ships, blaming it on Cuban subs.
Oh.
Oh, it gets better. One scenario actually involved, like, hijacking a U.S. passenger plane.
No way. For real.
Yeah, or even shooting one down, making it look like Cuba was behind it. They called it a Remember the Maine type incident.
Wow.
Trying to draw a parallel to that whole USS Maine explosion back in Havana Harbor, the one that basically started the Spanish-American War.
It's just, I don't know, it's chilling to me. They were trying to use this past tragedy, something that people felt deeply about, to basically drum up support for another war. Did anyone involved in this, did anyone say, hey, maybe this isn't such a good idea?
The documents, they do show there were some internal disagreements, definitely some concerns raised, like what about civilian casualties? What if the truth gets out?
Right.
How's that going to play for America's image? But, the plan, it still made its way up the chain of command.
So someone, somewhere, thought this was a good idea, at least on paper. Did it actually get any closer to being put into action?
Yeah, actually it did.
Mm.
In March of '62, they presented the whole Operation Northwoods plan to President Kennedy.
You're kidding. They actually took it to the president.
Yeah, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they put it right on his desk, asking for the green light.
Can you imagine being in that room? So what happened? Did Kennedy buy it?
Thankfully, no. Kennedy shot it down. He saw right through it, recognized how disastrous it could be, both for the U.S. and the world.
What a relief. But still, the fact that it even got that far, it's kind of terrifying, It really makes you think about how much power a president has, how one decision can change everything. But let's say, just for a second, that Kennedy had gone along with it. What would have happened if they had actually put Operation Northwoods into motion?
Honestly, it's impossible to say for sure, but it wouldn't have been pretty. Like, worst case scenario, you're looking at a full-blown war with Cuba. And remember, this is the Cold War. The Soviets were backing Cuba. Things could have easily spiraled out of control, even potentially leading to,
A nuclear war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a chilling thought. But even if it hadn't escalated into a global nuclear conflict, the fallout, just in the U.S. alone, would have been huge.
Yeah, imagine if the truth about Operation Northwoods ever got out.
Right. A government lying to its own people, staging attacks to justify a war.
The betrayal, the loss of trust, it would have been massive.
Completely. And beyond that, think about the precedent it would have set. If the U.S. could get away with something like that, faking an attack to justify invading another country?
It's a slippery slope.
Exactly. Who's to say they wouldn't try it again somewhere else?
Well,
it's a scary thought, really.
it really is. And this whole thing, it makes you realize that even though Operation Northwoods never actually happened, the fact that it was even considered is a big deal.
Absolutely. It shows how easily the lines can get blurred, between protecting your country and straight up manipulating people.
Yeah. And this was all happening back in the 60s. But you could argue that today we're dealing with similar issues, just in a different way.
Oh, for sure. I mean, Think about all the information overload we have now, the internet, social media, all the propaganda.
It feels impossible sometimes to figure out what's real and what's not.
Right. And that's why it's so important to learn from things like Operation Northwoods. We have to be critical thinkers, question what we see and hear, especially when it comes from those in power.
Absolutely. But how do we do that? How do we become more discerning, more informed in a world that's constantly trying to manipulate us?
Wow.
But how do we do that? How do we become more discerning, more informed in a world that's constantly trying to manipulate us?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. There's no easy answer, unfortunately, no magic bullet.
Right.
But I think it really starts with being a little skeptical, you know, especially when you're seeing information that just happens to perfectly align with what you already believe.
So basically, don't believe everything you read on the internet.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good starting point. But it's more than that, right? It's about really looking at where you're getting your information from.
Okay.
Like, are you getting it from sources that are, known for being reliable, real news organizations, experts, academics, or is it just random stuff you see on social media?
The echo chamber, right. You only see what you agree with.
Yeah, exactly. So you got to break out of that, read different news sources, even the ones you don't necessarily agree with. See what they're saying.
That's tough, though, right?
It is. It takes effort. And don't just take things at face value. Look deeper, Go beyond the headlines. Figure out who's really behind the information, what their agenda might be.
So we all have to become like amateur detectives or something.
In a way, yeah, you got to think critically, question things.
Right.
And it's important to remember, like, nobody's immune to this stuff. We all have our biases. We all get tricked sometimes. But the more we know about how information can be manipulated, the better equipped we are to spot it.
That makes sense. So we've been talking a lot about Operation Northwoods, but you mentioned earlier that it was actually part of this even bigger operation, right? Operation Mongoose. What was that all about?
Right, so Operation Mongoose, that was the code name for a whole secret program that President Eisenhower authorized back in 1960. And then Kennedy, he continued it. And the goal was basically to get rid of Castro, topple his government by any means necessary.
Wow.
Yeah, and they were using all sorts of tactics, too. Economic sabotage, propaganda, even trying to infiltrate the Cuban government, assassinate Castro.
It sounds like something straight out of a movie.
I know, right.
Gotcha.
But this was real life, and it just goes to show the lengths that the U.S. was willing to go to during the Cold War.
It's a lot to process. So Operation Northwoods, as crazy as it was just one small part of this much larger covert effort to get rid of Castro.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that there's often a lot more going on behind the scenes than we realize. And that's why it's so important to keep asking questions, to keep digging for the truth, because you never know what you might find.
That's for sure. Well, this has been a wild ride. Operation Northwoods, it's one of those things, it's almost too crazy to believe it actually happened.
I know, right?
But it did. And it just goes to show history is full of these crazy stories, these what-if moments that could have changed everything. And it's our job to learn from them, to make sure something like this never happens again. So, for all of you listening, we've only just scratched the surface here. If you want to go deeper, check out the show notes. We'll have links to all the declassified documents so you can read them for yourself.
Yeah, definitely check those out.
It's fascinating stuff. But be warned, it might keep you up at night. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep an open mind, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
See you then.